Go ahead, and will everyone please mute themselves?
Like pretty much everybody is. That's great. Well, thank you very much, Jane. I really appreciate this invitation, and thanks to all of you for giving up some time in the middle of this beautiful day at least it's a beautiful day in Maine, to come on this journey with me. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. I'm afraid to touch it now. Sorry about that technical difficulty. Okay, so we're all on board and ready for this journey. Okay, so this is was not the first cross-country road trip ever undertaken by automobile, and it wasn't the first one even undertaken by women, but it was the first one undertaken specifically for a cause, and that, of course, was women's suffrage. And these are the three women who made the trip, made it all the way across the country. I'm going to talk a little bit about them in a minute. We have Sarah Bard Field on the left, and Maria Ginberg in the middle, and Ingeborg Ginstedt on the far right. And they're standing next to the automobile they took across the country. But before we get into more of the details about the participants in the trip, I think it's useful to just ponder this statement for a minute. And in 1915, the U.S. Constitution explicitly recognized only men's voting rights. They've been working on suffrage for, depending on when you date it from, at least 67 years, 3 generations of women and men who've been working on trying to get women the right to vote. And they're 5 years away from passing and ratifying the 19th Amendment. And of course, they don't really know whether they're 5 years away or 10 years away or, a couple more generations away. They have no idea. They think they're close, but progress has been really slow. So if you date it from Seneca Falls, the convention that happened in 1848, the billed as the first ever women's rights convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized that with Lucretia Mott and some other friends. Susan B. Anthony wasn't there at that convention, but she teamed up later with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they were quite the dynamic duo for decades. So if you date it from Seneca Falls, it had been 67 years that they've been working on suffrage, and there had been over 500 state campaigns. Only 12 states had given women voting rights through that process. So, to get a suffrage won through a state, you had to first petition the legislature to pass it. And often that would have been a 2/3 vote in both chambers. And sometimes there are some more complicated rules, like it had to get passed 2 years in a row or two legislative sessions in a row before it could go to the voters. And then once it cleared the legislature, you had to take it out to the voters and have them all approve it. Of course, they would all be men, so you had to, persuade them to do it. So it was a lot of work, and there was no, social media or faxes or internet or any of that kind of crazy stuff that we've been able to rely on in our lifetimes. And so it was a lot of hard work. So that was one of the reasons why progress had been so slow. It was also slow because to get to this point, they had to overcome centuries of misogyny that was embedded in our laws and our religion and our social customs. And that stuff doesn't change quickly. But in 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and some others formed the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage and decided they were going to go after an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women. And one of the ways that they were going to do that was to hold the political party in power responsible for failing to move a federal suffrage amendment through Congress. And in 1915, this was the Democrats. So what they did was in 1914, they'd fanned out to those 12 states where women had the vote. And the organizers told those women and men, listen, vote against the Democrats. We don't care who you vote for, just vote, just vote against the Democrats, and because we need to hold them responsible for not advancing our measure through Congress. So here's a little, actually this was a stamp from the time, from that era. You can see these are the suffrage states are all west of the Mississippi. You can see that the eastern states and the south are all pretty locked up and not giving women any voting rights at all. And so what the organizers, again, are telling people is it means the freedom for women to vote against the party this donkey represents. Here's another graphic from the time. I love this graphic. It's just, there's a whole lot of stuff happening here. The woman voter, and this is the crux of this whole trip, the woman voter of the West is striding across the country. She's dressed in this glorious costume. She's a woman of power. She's coming to the aid of her benighted Eastern sisters who are kind of mired in the pit of despair over here because they don't have the right to vote. There's, like I said, there's kind of a lot of stuff happening in this photo or in this graphic. One of the things you notice is that she's white. The glorious woman suffrage voter, woman voter of the West. She's white. She's young. She looks, smart and powerful. And that is very much the image that they were trying to project of this is the woman voter we're talking about. We're not talking about those black people. We're not talking about those, Hispanics or those Mexicans, or the Chinese or anybody of those. This is a white, waspy kind of woman. And she's young and she's smart and she's going to rescue not just really, the claim was, no, she wasn't just rescuing the women voters the would-be women voters of the East, but she's also, the women voters are going to rescue the country. They're going to make the country a better place to be. So here's another example of the stuff at the time. Women of Colorado, this is a big billboard you see she's putting up here, vote against the Democratic Party and Woodrow Wilson because he opposes national women's suffrage. So that's, again, the sort of crux of this whole trip. That's the whole premise. What they're going to do is send a car across from the Panama Pacific International Exposition, basically a World's Fair in San Francisco in 1915, and send it to DC, to Congress and the President. Now, the Panama Pacific was in San Francisco, and it was an effort on San Francisco's part to kind of bootstrap itself up out of this terrible earthquake that had happened several years before that had really leveled large parts of the city. But it became this sort of rallying point, and even though it was kind of put together with, pasteboard and glue, and some glittery paint, it held up over the course of the year that the fair was in existence. The Congressional Union was the only suffrage organization to have a booth at the fair. And so they had, here's what it looked like. I'm sorry for the grainy photograph, but I had to kind of blow it up. And so they had that "We Demand" banner, that's what they called it, that banner at the back of the room. And they distributed literature about suffrage. And they had people sign a petition demanding an amendment to the US Constitution enfranchising women. And they had a display of dolls there at the back where the dolls from the Western voting states were all dressed in bright clothes and looked really happy. And the dolls from the Eastern states were all dressed in drab clothing and looked miserable because they lived in this kind of half-life of not being able to vote. So they definitely had used a lot of humor and in order to get their points across. So they have this great idea, and it's really a terrific location for them, because 19 million people are going to come through that World's Fair from all over the planet during the course of its time being open. So they have a lot of people coming through their booth, and they're also aligning themselves with the future, with modernity, with new thinking. And so right next to them is a booth where they're exhibiting these new voting machines. And so people could actually go to that booth and try out these new voting machines. And down the hall is the, there's all kinds of educational stuff like Mount Holyoke and various women's colleges, Smith College is there. They've got booths, and they're just all kinds of different amazing things that as well as art and other cultural stuff that they're aligning themselves with. And their original plan was they were going to send 100 cars across from the Panama Pacific to DC. That was an entourage that nobody could ignore. And so all through the spring, you see in the Suffragist, their weekly newspaper, the Congressional Union's weekly newspaper, these plans afoot of they're going to send 100 cars. But by August, nobody has volunteered. Everybody loves this idea, but nobody's volunteered to do the trip because they knew it was going to be really hard. And so they were kind of fretting when into the booth one day walk some, the Swedes. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute, but they're basically like, yeah, we took a boat out here from our home in Providence, Rhode Island, and we'd always planned to buy a car and drive it back and do some sightseeing. And Providence isn't that far from DC, so we'll take the petitions. And then they also have to take the envoys, who are the messengers from the women voters of the West. So they have this great plan. They're going to launch these envoys eastward from the end of this women voters convention. So this is the first ever convention of women voters anywhere in the world. They're having it at the San Francisco Exposition in mid-September there. And so here are the three women who really make the trip. Maria Ginberg was 55 years old at the time of this trip. She bought the car and drove it. She was a midwife in Providence, had delivered 2,000 plus babies by the time she made it out to San Francisco. She was known to be the more, kind of docile and loving, maternal kind of member of the party. And then we have Ingeborg Ginstedt, who's the mechanician or the mechanic, and also the backup driver. Ingeborg was 50 years old at the time of this trip. Both she and Maria are naturalized U.S. citizens. They'd come to the U.S. in the early 1890s, emigrating from Sweden. And they had, Ingeborg had worked at the Swedish Young Women's Home, and then later had her own business. She called it an intelligence business, but basically she was doing background checks on Swedes who were seeking employment in domestic employment for families or work in the factories and mills. And especially when they were fresh off the boat, nobody would know them. So Ingeborg would do that intelligence work. And but she was also a radical. She was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and fancied herself an organizer and a lecturer too. She was known to be much more irascible, short-fused, and she was pretty annoyed that she and Maria didn't get to do any public speaking on this trip, and they kind of end up getting treated like the hired help, and that kind of pisses her off, and that causes problems along the way. But Sarah Bard Field is the envoy who makes it all the way across the country. She's a poet. She's in her mid 30s, like 34 or so. She doesn't know how to drive a car, actually, but she is a divorced mother of two. Her ex-husband lives in San Francisco, and she's leaving the kids with him while she takes off on this trip. She's getting paid to do it. The Swedes didn't get any pay because they were planning to make the trip anyway. So they end up, their vacation, their sightseeing vacation gets kind of ruined because they get flogged across the country. But Sarah gets paid to go. And she's kind of a hot mess at the time of this trip. She had a lover who was 30 years her senior, and he lived with his wife and children in Portland, Oregon. She didn't get to see him too often because she lived in San Francisco. And she'd had malaria in the summer before they left. And she also had a bad heart, and her heart gives her a lot of problems, especially at high elevations. So she's just kind of really a mess when she takes off, but nobody, like I said, nobody else would do it. She had experience as a suffrage organizer in Oregon and Nevada. And so they know she can speak from a stage, and they know she's tough, and they just say, well, we'll just we'll have to get her across as best we can. Now, Mabel Vernon was the advance organizer for them, and she was from Delaware, graduate of Swarthmore with Alice Paul. She was a couple years ahead of her. And she had been working as a teacher until Alice recruited her to work for the Congressional Union. Her job was to sort of hopscotch across the country in front of the envoys and set up these mass meetings. And she had just a grueling time of it. She was very bright, very capable, and worked really hard. So she gets a shout out. The envoy, there was a second envoy, a fourth person on the trip, who should have been in the car. She was, her name was Frances Joliffe, and she was a wealthy socialite who was recruited because they thought that she could hobnob with the rich and famous as they went across the country and do some fundraising for them. But she only made it as far as Sacramento. She got to the first stop and she bailed. I don't have a picture of her. And then the Overland 6 was the car, its own kind of character. They bought it new at the exposition. It was built by the Willis Overland Company in Toledo, Ohio, and they had dropped the price and sort of done some special advertising and packaging to boost their market share by promoting it at the exposition. Including promoting it in Swedish language newspapers, which I think is maybe where the Swedes caught up with it. It had a top speed of around 50 miles an hour on good roads, but it sounded, you could actually go to YouTube and type in Overland 6 1915 or something, and you can see an example, a real life example of a vintage automobile and how noisy it was. As it kind of toodles down the road, it was like 6 sewing machines in your ear at once. It was really loud. It ran on just about any kind of fuel you could think of to put in it, and that made it easier to find fuel, as there weren't service stations the way there are now. But they had to strap their bags to the side of the car, and the fuel cans are on the other side. It's missing one big deal, which is a roof. There is a kind of a roll-up roof that they do pull up when the weather really gets bad, but it kind of traps the fumes, so they prefer to travel with it down as much as they can, but that exposes them to wind and sun and all kinds of temperatures. So it's a tough ride. So we're back at the Panama Pacific here, and they decide they're going to have staged this last event of the Women Voters Convention in the Court of Abundance at the PPIE. And this was a really cool court because you can see that water fountain there. They had these steam pipes all around it that would, they had some sort of boiler beneath it, and they could make them belch out these, big clouds of steam. So it had a very primordial kind of feel to it. And the last event was at night. And that you can see in this picture, not a great picture, but it's from a newspaper at the time. And they have women lined up along those steps, women and girls dressed in the purple, white, and gold colors of the National Women's or the Congressional Union. And they're, belting out patriotic songs and suffrage songs to entertain the crowd. And then around 10 o'clock, they have some final remarks, and the Court of Abundance is filled with like 10,000 people. I mean, there certainly weren't that many people at the convention, but they recruited more people from the Panama Pacific, just fairgoers, and so the court is just packed. And so Maria brings the car around to the front of the steps, and the envoys walk down the steps, get in the back seat, and the crowd kind of opens up and creates a lane for them. They all light these lanterns and escort them to the gates of the Panama Pacific, which swing open at their approach, and then they disappear into the night. And so that's this, it's kind of a great example of the amazing pageantry that they were so skilled at, and as they tried to, pique people's interest and get them excited about the suffrage movement. Now, they didn't actually leave San Francisco that night. They stuck around for another week or 10 days or so, I don't know what they were doing, but maybe they were registering the car or something. I don't know. But they hung out for a while. Sarah Bardfield's lover Erskine comes down to say goodbye. She spends some time with him. He brings her a buffalo skin blanket. He was an interesting person in his own right. He'd been an Indian fighter with the army and part of the group that chased Chief Joseph's band of the Nez Perce clear up to the Canadian border. And so he'd spent a lot of time in the desert, knew how cold it would get, so he kind of provisioned them, or at least Sarah. And so then they finally take off and they get to Sacramento and they have their first mass meeting. They do their speeches, and then Frances Joliffe is like, actually, I don't think I'm well. I can't make this trip, and so they have to go on without her. And there's no one to replace her. So off they go, and you can see they're following at least until they get to about Chicago. They're going to follow the Lincoln Highway, which was a kind of a glorious aspirational concept that had first been conceived of in about 1913. So, they hadn't had a lot of time to put it together. But the idea was that, America needed a coast-to-coast highway. Automobile manufacturers knew that the war in Europe meant that a lot of people weren't traveling to Europe anymore on vacation, and that they could go out from the East Coast, they could go out to the Panama Pacific if they only had the right road. And so they started promoting this Lincoln Highway, and these red, white, and blue markers are what are kind of all along the road. So they're going to go up sort of northward in California and over into Nevada through Reno, and then over to Salt Lake City and across the southern edge of Wyoming down to Denver, and then through Kansas and into Nebraska as well, and through Illinois and into Chicago. Then they head up to Michigan, to Detroit, and now they go through Ohio as well, and then they bump up into Buffalo and go across New York State and then down the eastern seaboard to DC. That's the general route. And they have a couple of months to do it, a little under. They left San Francisco late September, and they're due in DC on December 6th, which is the opening day of Congress. So I guess a little more than 2 months. But the roads are bad, and so it's not easy. So they get to Reno, and they have a big event there, and it's kind of a welcome home for Sarah, because not only because she organized there for suffrage, but while she was waiting for her divorce to come through from her ex-husband, she had to basically camp out in Nevada, which was the only state where she could get a divorce from. So it's kind of a welcome home for her, and then they take off eastward. And I don't know if you've ever driven across eastern Nevada, but I retraced their route in 2015, 100 years later. And so this is a photo from my trip. And this is the Alkali Flats east of Reno. So you could go, it's like I left San Francisco around the same time they did. It was really, really hot and dry. And I just cannot imagine. I was driving a new car also, but it had air conditioning and heat and good suspension, and I was on much better roads, and it was still exhausting. So I just cannot imagine going through these Alkali Flats in an open car. And Sarah at one point writes, one of the reasons why we know so much about this trip is that Sarah would write these voluminous letters to Erskine. And so she describes at one point that they're just plowing up dust in the car. And this is a photo, not from their trip, but from a museum that I stopped and visited on my way across the country. And this sort of gives you a sense of, doesn't say it's a Lincoln Highway, but this is pretty much what it looked like, at least in the West. And also just a little bit about the tires. This is a photo from a museum, but the tires were like bicycle tires. So if you got a flat, you had to pull the tire off, pull the tube out, patch it, pump it up again, hope the patch, held, put it back in the tire, and, put the tire back on the car. I think Ingeborg later estimated that she had to fix a dozen tires at least on their trip across the country. So they get into Salt Lake City. They actually, I should back up at, sorry, they had some problems coming across eastern Nevada. They'd hired a man in Reno to drive them to Salt Lake City because it was this trackless desert practically. And it was going to take them several days. And they didn't have a map. They'd left San Francisco without a map. So they really weren't sure where they were going. And if you think of like Amelia Earhart trying to hit that island in the Pacific, one of the things they had to do was get to this ranch called Ibapaw Ranch, which functioned as kind of an inn for travelers. And so they were due there at 10 o'clock at night. And at about midnight, Sarah wakes up and realizes that the driver is kind of slowing down and kind of looking scared. She says, "Where are we? What are we doing?" He said, "Oh, I think we're off the Lincoln Highway. I don't exactly know where we are." And so, she kind of panics, but they pull up to this crossroads and she gets out looking for signposts that at least tell them where they are and maybe give them some directions. And she finds a couple of cowboys who are wrapped up in their blankets asleep at the crossroads. And she wakes them up and says, "Do you know the way to Ibapaw Ranch?" And they do, unbelievably. But it's about 30 miles away. And so they draw them a map. The cowboys draw them a map and tell them exactly how to get to Ibapaw. And they roll into Ibapaw about 5 o'clock the next morning, or later that morning. And the ranchers turn out and, cook them a big breakfast and warm them up. They're frozen. It's so cold in the desert at night. But they realize they have to be in Salt Lake City the next day for a big event on the steps of the Capitol, and the governor's going to be there and some congressmen. I mean, they have to be there. So they decide, well, we're just going to have to keep driving. So they tell the driver, "Look, you said you knew the way. We're going to make you drive." So without any sleep, he drives straight through until about 1 or 2 o'clock the next morning, and they make it into Salt Lake City in time, and get some rest before they have to do this big event. So here they are in the steps of the Utah State Capitol, and you can see that on the left of the screen there a little bit is you can see Maria and Ingeborg. They look a little bit the worse for the wear. They're kind of bronzed and burnt and just kind of wiped out, but they have a great reception there. Utah had already enfranchised women, and in fact, they'd had to do it twice. So women have been voting there for quite a long time, and so they were really fired up about this journey. And so one of the things that this journey was designed to do was to make sure that the women voters in the West understood that their Eastern sisters weren't equally enfranchised, and a lot of people didn't know about that. So their part of their trip is designed to get people excited about that and to put pressure on their congressional delegation to get this through Congress. And the implied threat is that just as they had done in 1914, where they'd fanned out across those Western states, in 1916 it would be not just a congressional election, but a presidential election. And President Woodrow Wilson was running for re-election. And if they could get all 4 million women voters of the West to vote together as a bloc, they could determine the outcome of the presidential election. That's what they were saying. And everybody was like, I don't know, could they do it? Well, nobody knew. They'd never tried it before, but they might. What happens if they did? So they were definitely getting some interest from the Democrats as they did this trip. So one of the interesting things that happens in Salt Lake City is that that Sarah is just completely devastated because she finds out that she's not pregnant. She gets her period, and it's like, well, what were you doing? And so I guess when Erskine came down, her lover, down to San Francisco to see her off, and they slept together, and she was really hoping to have a baby with him, because she wasn't sure their relationship would ever work out, but she wanted something of his, to remember him by. And why she thought on this hellish trip that being pregnant, having morning sickness and everything else, would be a wonderful idea. And to show up, pregnant to meet with, pregnant with another man's, baby, to meet with Congress and the president, it just seems like it wasn't a well thought out idea. But anyway, she wasn't pregnant, but she was quite distraught about it. I think Erskine had 5 kids, so I think perhaps he might have been happy. So they head out, they go across the southern Wyoming, and head to Laramie, where Sarah does a talk at the university there. They're stopping in little towns along the way, and it's a really tough trip. They have to make 100, 120 mile drives every day over roads that are not always that great. But they get to Laramie, and then they're due the next day in Cheyenne to meet with the governor. Again, another mass meeting that Mabel has set up for them. And they get up in the morning to drive to Cheyenne, and it's snowing. And everybody's telling them, you can't make this trip. You can't get over the pass. It's far too dangerous. Nobody's going to try it today. Don't do it. But they're like, the governor's expecting us. We got to go. So they take off, and they meet several cars coming toward them as they head up towards the pass, all filled with men who have turned back because the roads are too dangerous. But somehow or other, they make it across the pass that day, and in time for their mass meeting. This photo is not from their trip, but again from a museum. But it just gives you a sense of what it might have been like up there. It's kind of it's hard to imagine how they actually did it. So they go on from there to Denver, and you can see now the travelers here in the front row are just looking pretty burned to a crisp. They've lost weight. It's just been really rugged traveling, and they've had almost no rest days. So they're jouncing around in the car all day long, having to attend all these mass meetings and dinners and do the different things in the evening, and they're just exhausted. So they do have these glorious meetings in Denver, and that just goes super well. Colorado is another state that already has enfranchised its women. It was the first one to do that through a statewide referendum process, actually. And they finally get down to Colorado Springs, where they do get a couple of rest days. But I love this photo because look at the looks on their faces. I mean, if you've ever done any long distance traveling with somebody, you know that even when it's with somebody you love, you get to the point where you can't stand them. These 3 women have been thrown together. They didn't choose each other as traveling companions necessarily, and it's not easy. The 4th person in the car is Bertha Fowler, who was the chair of the Colorado branch of the Congressional Union. So from there, they go down through southern Colorado to Pueblo, and then across southern Colorado into Kansas. And they get to Dodge City, and it's raining. And so their next big stay over is going to be Kansas City, Missouri. So they express ship their clothes and the petitions and all their luggage up to Kansas City, Missouri, and set out. And they're heading to Hutchinson and then to Emporia, because Sarah has an interview with William White, who's the editor of the Emporia Gazette, which was kind of like the New York Times of Middle America, if that makes any sense. I mean, he was a big deal editor, and she didn't want to miss that interview. So they decide, because it's raining, but they're into October by now. It's a cold rain, and they decide to take a shortcut through Nickerson to get to Hutchinson. They're going to spend the night in Hutchinson and go on to Emporia the next day, but they get stuck in the mud. Now, clearly this is not their car. It's just an example photo, but they get into a big mud puddle, and they're out in the middle of the fields, kind of like this picture shows. They holler for help for some time. It's, again, it's night. It's like 10 o'clock at night. Nobody comes, and they're sitting there, and what are they going to do? I mean, there's nobody who's going to come pull them out. There's no AAA. And so Sarah finally says, okay, I'm going to go back. We passed a farmhouse about a mile back. And so she gets out of the car, and it's funny to read her accounts of this trip back to this farmhouse, it extends from 1 to 3 miles, depending on which account you read. And she's either in hip deep or waist deep mud. But in any case, I'm sure it was difficult, and it was at night. And she finally does reach the farmhouse, wakes the farmer up. He hitches up his mules and comes back and tows them out of the mud pit. And they're able to get to Nickerson early in the morning. And they pound on somebody's door and they let them hang out in their kitchen. They don't light the fire or give them any coffee or anything warm to eat or drink. But they let them sit in their kitchen until daylight, and then they make it to Hutchinson. And they hang out in their hotel rooms for a few hours and get a little bit cleaned up, and then they take off for Emporia. In Hutchinson, they meet these Kansans who tell them, "Oh yeah, we heard you hollering in the fields last night. We knew it was you, but we figured if you wanted the right to vote, then you would just have to find your own way out of trouble." And Sarah just kind of rounds on them and says, "Are you kidding me? I mean, how many times have women been up in the night, say, taking care of some man who can't take care of himself? I mean, this is about common humanity. This is not about suffrage." And so they were absolutely furious with these men for not being helper, not helping them out. So anyway, they do make it to Emporia in time for the interview, but Sarah's clothes, she's just a complete mud cake from her trip through the mud. So she tells the editor that she'll do the interview. She's got to take her clothes off and send them off to be cleaned because she has another big suffrage event that night. And he can come to her hotel room and she'll just be under the covers. And that's the way they'll do their interview, which I think the Swedes were a little scandalized by that. They were kind of older school, but that was, that's what they had to do. All their clothes had been express shipped to Kansas City. So anyway, they do make it up to Kansas City. They go through Lincoln, Nebraska first, I guess. Yeah, and this is usually when they went to a town, there was this big, Mabel would have hired a military band usually or some sort of band, and the travelers, the envoys would stop outside of town, decorate the car with a Great Demand banner and some suffrage flags and things like that. And then often a group of women in their own cars, suffragists in their own cars, would meet them and sort of escort them to wherever the mass meeting was going to take place. But the band was an essential part of it because they made a lot of noise, and that helped to bring interest and an audience. But in Nebraska, that was not an equal suffrage state, and so all she could find was this bugler. That was the military band there. I want to talk a little bit about the petitions, because that is also something that sort of around this time you start seeing this correspondence taking place between Mabel Vernon and the suffrage headquarters. And this is prompted by a reporter saying, "I'd like to see those petitions. Where are they?" Now, they've been saying they have 500,000 signatures on this petition and that it's 18,000 feet long, which is the length of several football fields. And so you would think, I mean, even if it's a very light, kind of fragile paper, like tracing paper or something like that, it's, that's a lot of paper. And so she's like, we've shipped them on ahead, most of them. We just have the ones that we've picked up on our trip. But she reaches out to the DC headquarters of the Congressional Union saying, "What's up with the petitions? I mean, where are they?" And they're like, "I don't know. Aren't they out in San Francisco?" And she writes to San Francisco and the Congressional Union booth there. "No, we don't have them." And so the whole premise of this thing is they're bringing these 500,000 signatures to Congress and the president, and if they don't have them, they're going to look pretty bad. So they have to sort of scramble and fend off the reporters who are looking to see the petitions. But they've done all this publicity about this monster suffrage petition. So they get to, oh, I should say actually, before they get to Chicago, they do get to Kansas City, and they spend a few days there. And they travel back and forth to cities and towns around Kansas City. Excuse me, my throat is a little sore here. They on their way to Topeka, the state capital in Kansas, they get lost and they have a malfunction in the car. So that's the one place in their whole trip where they don't make their mass meeting on time. They and I don't know for sure, but I think it may be the place where Ingeborg finally loses her temper and tells Sarah, before this trip is over, I'm going to have to kill you. And this is one of the mysteries of the trip. Sarah never talked about it at the time, but she did later in her, you can find an oral interview from the 1960s of Sarah, Mabel, and of Alice Paul. They're all online. And anyway, Sarah talks about this event where Ingeborg had threatened to kill her and acted like she was really a lunatic and like she could have done it. I don't know. I mean, Sarah could be pretty irritating too, so maybe Ingeborg was justified. I don't know. But that was a tough go. So that was the one place they didn't make it in time, was Topeka. But they do show up in Chicago on time. This is the one photo where you see everybody smiling. And I think so. They're still having to, go pell-mell, but the roads are easier and the hotels and the food are definitely better. So I think everybody's a little bit happier by the time they get to Chicago. And they head along. They do get up to Detroit. Sarah is actually from Detroit, and they have a bit of a problem there because Mabel had recruited the Episcopal bishop there to be a big part of their events, and he's going to speak for them and encourage people to vote for suffrage. But he finds out, somebody whispers in his ear that Sarah is having an affair with a married man 30 years her senior, and he sort of puts the brakes on. He says, so when she gets to town, she has to go be interviewed by this bishop, and she's somehow able to mollify him and let him know that her relationship with Erskine is really based on love, and they hope one day to be together. So they get through that crisis. They when they're in Cleveland, they have to get to Buffalo next, and they actually put the car on a barge and barge it up to Buffalo because it's snowing and it's incredibly cold, and they don't want to do it. So here in this picture, they're in Brooklyn, New York. They finally made it to Brooklyn. You can see that here's Florence. I mean, here's Ingeborg with rocking this wonderful hat. It's interesting that there'd been this decree handed down that only the envoys, who are Sarah and Francis Joliffe, could speak from these many platforms that they're given across the country. And one of the reasons is that they actually live in San Francisco, which is an equal suffrage state, and the Swedes are from Rhode Island, which is not. And so the whole point of this was that the envoys from the women voters of the West are supposed to come to the East to petition Congress. But I think part of it was also that the Swedes spoke English with with kind of a funny accent. They didn't speak perfect English, and they dressed, they dressed kind of frumpily, and I think this hat maybe is an expression of that. But I love this photo. So they make it through, and actually Francis, I should say, shows up and rejoins them in Albany. Sarah has been begging her all the way across the country to come back because she's so wiped out. Her heart was giving her trouble at the higher elevations. She gets sick. She gets like a bad flu. I mean, and Francis is like, no. But she finally does show up in Albany in time to meet with the governor of New York there, and then is with them through the rest of the trip. But all the way across the country, Francis, the Congressional Union has acted as though Francis is with them. The press releases that they send out all talk about Frances Joliffe and Sarah Bard Field, and sometimes there's no mention of the Swedes in the newspaper coverage of their trip. It's all about Frances and Sarah, and the Swedes aren't even mentioned, even though they're doing so much to make this trip possible, and they're there, and Frances is not. And I think I've often wondered, because you actually do see it. I tracked down some articles in Swedish language newspapers, and those articles only mention Ingeborg and Maria. And I kind of wondered if Ingeborg was behind those. Anyway, so they get through to DC, and they're here in DC now, I think, and they're here's a welcome to a big poster, welcome to the envoys of women voters. And again, you see they talk about Mrs. Sarah Bard Field and Miss Frances Joliffe, but there's no mention of the Swedes here in this big poster. So that the opening day of Congress is December 6th, but it's also the kickoff of the Congressional Union's big national convention. And so there's going to be lots of different meetings that happen after that. So there's lots of people in town to greet the envoys when they come. So they meet up at the Stanton Square in a few blocks from the Capitol, and they have this kind of entourage that is accompanying them. There's marchers as well, and they're all carrying flags with the tricolors, the purple, white, and gold of the Congressional Union. And here they are coming up to the steps of the Capitol. The banner there talks about the Bristow-Mondale Amendment, but that's in recognition of the men who had most recently introduced it into Congress in the House and Senate. And here's the car at the steps of the coming up close to the Capitol steps. And behind them, you can see in the car, I think there's Ingeborg is standing up there and Maria's behind the wheel. But behind them, you can see these women lined up, and they actually have the scroll of the petitions. So I think what they did was when they got to Detroit, there were some Congressional Union organizers there who scurried about and gotten 4,000 signatures for them on the petitions. So that helped them out tremendously. And plus they had all the petitions they've been gathering across the country. And so they I don't know, glued or taped them all together and fashioned this scroll. So they had two women on either side of the scroll, and then 100 feet of it stretched out behind them with 10 women on each side holding on to the scroll, like the train of it. And here you can see them coming up the steps to meet with there something like 88 congressmen met them as part of this big pageant. Here they all are, and there's a formal back and forth with the members of Congress, and the women are the Congressional Union really wants to get the permission to speak from the floor of Congress about suffrage, and they don't get that, but they do get a hearing in front of the House Judiciary Committee later on in the week. Now, part of what's interesting about this photo is that you can see, I think right near the big column there at the top, Alva Belmont, Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, who was their wealthy benefactress, the Congressional Union's wealthy benefactress. I suspect that she was behind the decree that the Swedes not be allowed to speak, because she was a big promoter of this notion that the face of the suffrage movement should be white, it should be young, it should be educated young women. But next to her is Sarah Bard Field, and then I'm not sure who that woman next to her is. But I look at this photo. I never see the Swedes. I don't know where they are. So here this is what it all looks like. So you can see there was quite a big event there on the steps of the Capitol. From here, they make their way down Pennsylvania Avenue again in their big parade down to the East Wing of the White House, or East Room of the White House, where they meet with Woodrow Wilson. And he's pretty impressed by this. 300 women accompany them into the meeting with Wilson, 300 suffragists, and Sarah, tells them about the trip, and she does this sort of dramatic thing where she unfurls the scroll across the room so he could see all these signatures, and he buys it. He doesn't question that it's supposed to be 18,000 feet long, and nobody questions that, so they get through that crisis with intact. And Wilson had entered the presidency in 1912, saying that he hadn't really thought too much about suffrage. And then by 1915, the suffragists had worked hard on him, and he had sort of evolved to the point where he said, well, I do believe women should vote, but it should come through state action. And here these 300 women and the envoys are pressing on him to move the next step, which is to embrace suffrage through national action through an amendment to the Constitution, because they know that if he backs legislation, they've seen it, and they talk to him about it. Like, Mr. President, you backed the tariffs bill and it sailed through Congress. That's what we want you to do for suffrage. And so he doesn't commit to that, but he says, you've given me a lot to think about. And by the end of his second term, he will appear before a meeting of both houses of Congress, a joint meeting, in 1918, and say to them, look, you have to pass this suffrage amendment because I need women. I've needed them to prosecute the war, and I need them to prosecute the peace. And I'm getting hassled every single day for not doing this, so you need to do this for me. So they do get him in the end, but not in 1915. So here are the four travelers, the fabulous four. You can see they all look pretty weary at this point. Mabel Vernon later says that this was the hardest thing she had ever done, and that her health was never the same after it. She traveled by train, which was not much easier than traveling by car. I mean, it was enclosed, but they're coal fired trains, and so I think they were probably pretty smoky and smelly, and a lot of, and not too comfortable. Especially out west. So she was traveling by herself. She had to show up in a city often where she didn't know people very well, and try and drum up interest in suffrage. So that was not easy to do. So just to wrap up, I mean, I think it was a brilliant political stunt. It raised awareness, especially in those key Western states that most women couldn't vote. And it built support for the federal amendment. There was actually, or what Alice Paul calls the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. There was a rival suffrage amendment that the other major suffrage organization was promoting around this time, and they successfully kind of give that a burial and persuade women to unite behind what becomes the 19th Amendment. It really improved the visibility of the Congressional Union, which was just a few years old at that point. So it was a huge stunt for them. It attracted a lot of new volunteers, in part because there were 4 eastern states that had statewide suffrage referenda that fall. It was Michigan, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. And all 4 of them went down to defeat by 2-to-1 margins. And so I think the Congressional Union, women who were exhausted and bitter from those campaigns, could look around and say, you know what, the hell with this state by state thing. I'm just going to go work for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So I think they picked up a bunch of volunteers, and they made sure they went through all 4 of those states, by the way, on their way across the country. The envoys did. So they also just changed the paradigm. I mean, they said it was perfectly all right for women to exchange their political support for men advancing their measures, and that's what they were talking about. This was absolutely scandalous. They were attacked in the press. There was a lot of animosity toward them, but I think in the end, it was their tactics that accelerated the successful conclusion of this generations-long campaign. So the 19th Amendment, this is the wording of it if you've never read it. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Again, 72 years from the Seneca Falls Convention, if you just count it from 1848, but much longer than that if you go back to the founding of the country, which I think properly we ought to. Later on, you can see that the Equal Rights Amendment, which Alice Paul helps author and arranges to be introduced into Congress in 1923, is very similar. I love this quote from Alice Paul that I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality. Great quote from her. So I got interested in this trip when I was in the course of doing this research for my book about my great-grandmother, and you can find out more about it there on her website. When I came across in 2015, I met with women's rights activists and leagues of women voters and blogged about it at suffrageroadtrip.blogspot.com. So you can catch that there, some more information about the trip. I'm also just in the process of publishing a novel about this trip. It should be out later this fall. And I decided I was originally going to write a nonfiction book, but then decided that I really wanted to tell it from the Swedes' perspective, and I couldn't do that. I just couldn't find enough information, so I decided to fictionalize it. So I'm going to try and unshare my screen here. If I can do this without stop presenting. There we go. And if you can unmute yourselves, and if you're interested in asking any questions about the trip, I'd be happy to answer them.
I want to know.
Before the questions, I just want to say thank you, Anne. That was just great. And we really appreciate your coming to us live from Maine.
Thanks for having me. This is fun. I love talking about this trip. It's just so much fun. Yeah, Betty?
I'm very eager to know which of these amazing women was your great-grandmother.
She was not on this trip. She was, I think she was there in DC when they arrived, because she was the chair of the Maine branch of the Congressional Union. And I think she went down to that conference that I mentioned that happened from the December 6th to the 12th. So I think she was there when they arrived, but not, she wasn't on that trip itself. But she was quite interested in that trip. And later on in 1930, she and a friend from Maine actually did the trip in reverse, kind of. I mean, they left Maine on January 1st, 1930, and drove to Sacramento, I think, Pasadena or something. They took a southern route, though, because it was winter.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in North Carolina, and I have racked my brain to think if I ever heard either of my grandmothers or any other older women in my family talk about suffrage, and I cannot come up with a single fragment. But I do know that I married a man years ago, my ex-husband, whose name is last name is Anthony, and my daughter, therefore, is Susan B. Anthony's third cousin 6 times removed.
That's awesome.
Very important. My daughter's got that headline, and I'm delighted for her to have it.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Good for you.
Didn't have any children, so it's by cousins.
Right. In fact, I think there was some business where Susan B. Anthony's nephew introduced at one point in time, introduced the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress.
Yes.
Yeah.
No.
Any other questions?
How was your own
comments? I mean,
when you tried to reproduce the trip?
It was hard. Obviously, it was immeasurably easier in many respects because like I had a much better car and much better roads. But I was also on a timeline. I had planned to arrive in DC. I think it was right before Thanksgiving, and I planned to have an event at the Capitol. My U.S. rep Shelley Pingree, had helped reserve a room at the House Office building. And so I had that deadline, and I'd met some descendants of Erskines. So they're like step great granddaughters of Sarah Bard Field. And they flew out, they were going to fly out and meet me out in DC and come to the celebration. And they actually orchestrated the entire celebration, including emceeing it. Thank God for that, because I wouldn't have been able to pull it off. But just, coming across, doing the travel and trying to blog and meeting with activists and trying to set up meetings with activists. I mean, I did have a little bit of a flavor as to how hard that really was. And for me, that trip, it was like a master's degree in 10 weeks or something. I mean, I learned so much about what had my interest was really like what difference having had the vote had meant to women in the preceding 100 years. And I'm embarrassed to admit at how ignorant I was at how hard women have had to work to get everything that they've won, every right they've won, and how precarious that is right now. I mean, and you see this as we're looking at this new Supreme Court nominee. The only constitutionally protected right that women have is the right to vote. Every other right that women have won has come through statute or some judicial ruling or regulation, executive order, whatever it might be. Those things, they can be undone pretty quickly. All you need is majority in Congress or a President Trump, and things can unravel pretty quickly. And I don't think I'm paranoid in saying that, and I know a lot of people share that concern.
Yes.
Yes. You're here. And Annie, this is Louisa Moore, and Annie is, I'm proud to have Annie as my first cousin, and just feel very fortunate that she's done the work to put together this family story, which is captured in the book, Voting Down the Rose. And I do recommend it, especially for anyone who has a tie to Maine, but for anyone, because of the courage that is personified in that book. And look forward to the next one.
Yeah, the next one, it's a fun story, and you've already gotten a lot of the meat and potatoes of it. But I mean, one of the things that I did differently in the novel is, or could do differently, is that I really embedded it in the time in 1915. So, for example, when they came through Salt Lake City in 1915, the activist Joe Hill, you may have heard of him, he was a member of Industrial Workers of the World, right? He was a radical. And he was in prison, in Sugar House Prison in Salt Lake City. He was about to be executed for the murder of a grocer that he claimed he had not murdered the man, but and then he'd been framed, but he refused to give an alibi for that night. But anyway, so I have Ingeborg meet with him, and that didn't happen on the original trip, but I was able to do that as a fictional account. And there's just, there are a lot of ways that 1915 is scarily similar to events happening today. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of anti-immigrant sentiment, a lot of ambivalence about women's equality then, and you can still see that today, and a lot of anti-labor sentiment. So it just it gave me an opportunity to kind of sort of say, look, this was happening then too. It's not new, but it's something, and we've had to work really hard. We just have to keep working hard to make this right. And there's a tremendous amount of racism as well too. I need to be clear about that.
Yeah. What's the name of your book?
I think I'm going to call it We Demand, but there may be a subtitle as well. I need to decide this, but I can't quite pull the trigger on it.
And the older book?
Oh, the other book is it's Voting Down the Rose, and it's Voting Down the Rose, Florence Brooks White House and Maine's Fight for Women's Suffrage. And the first part of the title there, the rose was the symbol of the Maine suffragists. The rose was the symbol of the Maine anti-suffragists. And so the pro-suffragists used the daffodil in Maine. And so in Voting Down the Rose, they're kind of voting down the anti-suffragists, and there's an exchange of poetry that happened that my great grandmother was part of, where that voting down the rose was a refrain in one of the poems, and so that's where I took it from.
I wanted to.
Annie,
Go ahead.
I just want to mention a great discovery in the course of this talk today was the Swedish part. And Peter here has Swedish relatives, ancestors who came over to this country, grandmother who was equally courageous in her immigration to the US and what she did when she got here. And we've taken a lot of interest in that story, and you've inspired us to go on with that side of the family as well.
She always told me
that's great.
Say it again.
She always told me I had to vote. Always.
Yes. Yeah, the Swedes, Sweden was a pretty tough place to live in the latter half of the 19th century. I mean, it was, and there were millions and millions and millions, something like 20% of the entire country came to the US in successive waves. Initially, they came for, I think, religious freedom, and then there was some chain migration, but there was a huge famine that happened, and it was a really tough place for women to live. But so I think they got out, and they made a life, and that's one of the things that's so interesting is that they sort of personified that up from the bootstrap, up by the bootstraps kind of American grit in their own lives, but that was not part of the story that the Congressional Union wanted to tell, and so they weren't ever allowed to tell it. In later life, I'll just mention that Maria actually committed suicide in 1921. We don't really know why. One of her great nephews or something reached out to me via the web and gave me that information, and Ingeborg ends up going back to Sweden, retiring back home to Sweden.
Wow.
Yeah, Betsy.
I want to tell a story about my grandmother because it is so typical of the women of that period, because she never talked to me about suffrage, but she grew up in a poor family in North Carolina. And she married my grandfather when he was an up-and-coming young businessman, and he made a great deal of money selling Model T Fords from a catalog. There were no dealerships. And he would go around North Carolina, these little towns, and find out who the three richest men were. They were always men, of course, the bank president and the doctor and the lawyer, and sell them a car from pictures. And he was very successful at that. And he did teach my grandmother to drive. However, he would not let her solo. So one of the things she did at around this time was that he used to come home for lunch. The man of the house came home for lunch. And one day when he drove into the driveway and came in the side door, she ran out the back door, jumped in the Model T Ford, backed it out of the driveway, and drove off by herself. They'd gone a few minutes and then came back and drove back in the driveway. And that was the end of the discussion about whether she could solo or not.
That was beautiful.
Great story.
So she did her part.
She did. Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy to think of that happening in, house after house, drawing room after drawing room, all over the country. I mean, I always say that suffrage was won not just in DC, but in every parlor, across the country. Every woman had to fight it some way.
Where do you live in Maine?
I live in this town called Gray, which is just north of Portland, about 50 miles north of Portland.
Yeah.
Yep.
We come to Maine every summer, so for a family place way down east.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, we're stop on the turnpike. A lot of people know Gray just because they drive through it.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.
Well, thanks for your interest and for spending some time with me on this journey. And I hope to see you again. I do other talks, including on the ERA and on my great grandmother. So perhaps we could put together another one some other time.
Nice.
Great. Thank you
Nice.
so much, Anne. We
All
really
right, take care, everyone. Be well.
Annie.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you.